I'm Emma Lubitsch, and you're watching CAN TV. We're here today with Yohnka of the ACLU of Illinois to talk about the upcoming election and their campaign, 2020 election, Let People Vote. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Emma. It's great to be here.
So give us an overview of what the campaign sets out to do, and then we can get into some specifics from there.
Sure. So both as an affiliate here in Illinois and obviously working with our colleagues across the nation, the effort here is simply to give people as much information as we can about their opportunities to vote, encourage people to make a plan to vote, and then subsequently, and I think this is the other element of it that we are not seeing here in Illinois, but as we look across the country, is litigating wherever we have to, where there are efforts underway in an attempt to block people or create undue obstacles and burdens for people to vote. As you know, the last 7 years in specific, ever since the Supreme Court ruling in Shelby County versus Holder that undid the Voting Rights Act and the enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act, we've just seen hundreds of measures adopted across the country, which really are attempts to, limit the capacity of people to vote and to exercise the franchise. And so one of the things that we want to do on a national level is to create both information as well as an infrastructure to really push back and fight against those kinds of measures.
Can you give some examples of the voter disenfranchisement that has taken place across the states?
Absolutely, and I'm gonna stop for just a second, if you don't mind, and go back and explain a little bit of what happened in the Shelby County decision. In the early 2000s, the Congress went through the process of renewing the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things that they did as part of that process was to review a section of the Act, Section 5, which said that states and jurisdictions, and there were jurisdictions all over the country that had a record of suppressing the vote, have to have to submit any changes in their voting systems to the Justice Department's Voting Rights Division for clearance before they could put them into effect. Mm-hmm. And the ruling in Shelby County essentially said that was no longer needed, and therefore the Supreme Court knocked it down. Now, one thing I want to just add very quickly, two things, I guess. The first is that it was, Congress had just produced a record of, hundreds of thousands of pages about why it should be necessary. And 5 justices, less than a decade later decided it wasn't. We hear all the time about, things like, judicial activism, striking down the will of the people. That feels like just that, given the fact that Congress had overwhelmingly, and by a bipartisan vote, done that. The other thing is I guess, thinking about this week, is of course that Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said of that decision that this is a little bit like throwing out an umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And so what's happened since that decision is we have gotten wet. And then let me turn to your specific question. If you look at just one state, and I'm just going to pick on North Carolina for just a moment, the Republican leadership in North Carolina actually commissioned a study about how people vote in their state, whether they use early voting, whether they use mail-in ballots, whether they avail themselves of whether or not they have to walk to their polling place and it's convenient because it's within a few blocks in your own neighborhood. They commissioned a study, and then they, with what a court has labeled since that time, surgical precision, set about changing the rules in North Carolina so as to assure that people who tended to vote Democrat, and specifically people of color and older voters, were disenfranchised and removed from the things which they had found convenient in terms of mechanisms to vote. We have challenged those restrictions. We've also challenged restrictions around the country on the use of so-called voter ID laws, one of which litigation that we did back in 2016 and 2018, and I think will probably be renewed again in Wisconsin, in which the state has said that they will provide free identifications cards to voters if they don't have them, and then reneged on that bargain and has not provided them. So all of those things are issues which the ACLU has been involved in across the country. I'll just add, one of my other favorite things about voter ID is, if you look like in Texas and in Wisconsin, you can vote with a firearms registration card, but you can't vote with an ID from a university. Both state issued, but one, clearly favoring one set of voters over the others.
Right. And so let's talk about voting by mail. So what do people need to know about voting by mail in the November elections? And then, considering the slowdowns and concerns around USPS, I mean, is it advisable to encourage people to vote by mail?
It's a really good question. So here's the three things that I would share. Number one, voting by mail is perfectly legitimate and it's perfectly safe. In 2020, in the state of Illinois, you are going to get, if you are a registered voter and you voted in the last couple of elections, or if you register to vote now, you are then permitted to use that registration, or if you voted in those other things, you're going to get an application you're going to get an application to vote by mail. And you're going to get reminders in September and October reminding you, if you're a registered voter, that you can vote by mail. In many locations, and right here in Chicago, you can fill out that application online. The Chicago Board of Elections permits you to fill out the application for that mail-in ballot right online. When you get that ballot, when you fill out that form and you're notified that you've filled out the form and you get the ballot, there are two things. The first is you should go ahead, and fill it out as quickly as you're comfortable, as you're ready to vote, you prepared, and you've gone through the process of looking at the ballot. And then you should get it back as soon as possible. And the reason for that is to use the term, that we've used in the pandemic, we want to flatten the curve in terms of the number of ballots that are in the postal system at any given time. We're all concerned about what's happening in the post office and the Postal Service. And one way to alleviate that is to ensure that you can go ahead and return that as soon as possible. But here's the other thing, and I think this is, I should stop and say, you can return that, by the way, even if you don't have postage and don't feel comfortable going to the post office. The election authorities still have to accept those ballots even without adequate postage, because obviously this is really critical in order for us to play a role in that process. The other thing is that election authorities, and we'll see this obviously here in Chicago, are going to create other opportunities for people to drop off their ballots in drop boxes, which are going to be placed across the city and obviously across the state. These drop boxes will be secure. They won't require you to find postage or to figure out when you want to do that. But as soon as you're done mailing or done filling out that mail-in ballot, you can take that directly to one of these drop boxes. And again, the Board of Elections on their website will have that information And you can then cast your ballot that way. You'll know it's there, you'll know it's in place. And I think one of the other great things is that the Board of Elections is, you know, when you go and request a ballot, when you return it, they're going to keep you informed every step along the way in the process. So you'll know that your application has been received and is being processed. You'll know that your ballot is on the way to you. You'll know that your ballot has been returned, and you'll know that it's been approved, you know, obviously in terms of your signature and other things that have to be checked in order for it to count. So this kind of information is, I think, really critical to assuring that all of us have confidence that our ballots are actually going to be counted and processed. And I think we'll keep away, although I'm not sure we can, you know, from charges that somehow the election's been rigged.
Right. And so you can also request a vote by mail ballot and then vote in person, and it wouldn't be double counted, correct?
That's right. So and in that instance, if you get a mail-in ballot and you decide instead that you want to go to early voting or you want to go and vote in person, all you need do is bring that mail-in ballot with you to the site. They will capture that ballot since it's not going to be used, and then they will allow you to go ahead and place your vote. The trick of this is that if you don't have that ballot with you, they may ask you to provide only a provisional ballot, and then you have to go through the process of demonstrating that you haven't cast a second ballot in order for the provisional ballot to be counted. So, you know, one of the things that I hear people who you know this area well is they say, you know, make a plan now as to which you want to do. Make a plan right now about how you're going to return that ballot, if you're going to do it by mail or if you're going to go vote. And we should just say that in terms of in-person voting, you know, there are going to be extended and expanded hours for early voting. With, you know, in terms of this, those expanded out, you know, that early voting is going to begin in October. And provide lots of opportunity for people to be able to, you know, to vote. You know, all of those sites are going to be conditioned on, you know, understanding the necessarily kinds of social distancing and other things that need to be put in place in terms of COVID. But, you know, one of the things that we know is in early voting, the earlier you go, if you can go in the middle of the day, there tend to be fewer crowds. You're not going to run into people. And if you're just much more comfortable voting that way, that's an excellent opportunity to do that. And again, to be assured that your vote is registered and is there and is counted.
Right. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think many Americans are pretty concerned about the fate of the Postal Service in this country. So can you give us more information about what has taken place over the past months and then how that could impact not just the upcoming election, but then life for many Americans going forward?
Right. So one of the things, you know, the United States Postal Service, and I want to emphasize and underscore the word service for this conversation, is operated by an independent board of governors. And a few months ago, I think in a way that probably didn't capture the kind of media attention that this ultimately did, the USPS Board of Governors appointed a new Postmaster General by the name of Louis DeJoy. We should say that virtually every Postmaster General going all the way back to Benjamin Franklin was someone who had, you know, who had experience in the post office and in how the post office worked. And instead, Louis DeJoy seemed to have experience in private companies that competed with the post office, and his main I'm just going to repeat what several people have said. His main attribute seemed to be that he was a major Republican donor. In fact, just a little bit of an interesting point that came out in this, recent hearing on this in the House of Representatives. Louis DeJoy was not even among the 53 finalists for the job when the Board of Governors and its search committee first did the work, and then through intervention of party or parties unknown, he suddenly becomes the candidate. Fast forward, he begins to implement a series of changes in the way that the postal system works, which are designed to, quote unquote, make it run more efficient and like a business. And again, I want to underscore, nobody ever said that the Postal Service is supposed to be a business. It is supposed to be a service. And I just have to say on a really personal note, I grew up in a town of less than 1,000 people. And for communities like that, and for the communities of the people surrounding it who lived in, rural areas, they literally, that postal service is a lifeline. And, what Mr. DeJoy did was two important things in particular, which was he began to take out these sort of large sorting machines that prepare, enormous amounts of mail, some 30,000 pieces, sometimes an hour, and sorts them to exact locations to be delivered. And the second thing he did is he changed the policy so that if sorting was falling behind, that delivery people and others had to leave the facility at a set hour, even if they didn't have everything they were to deliver that day. And it forced them to stop at a particular hour, even if they had packages and letters left to deliver. So what happened quickly as the result of this was mail began to back up. That mail, both in terms of deliveries, in terms of packages and other things, began to fall behind. And that could be everything from, your and my probably credit card bills or utility bills or payments to those companies as well, to things like pharmaceuticals, which many people get their prescriptions through the mail these days, to other kind, to even just frankly a note or a letter from a friend or a relative. And so obviously these slowdowns were very marked in places and communities across the country. They seem to be targeted mainly in large urban areas. And one of the realities of that was that there began to be, I think, a significant fear that, ballots and mail for the election would not be delivered on time.
Right. Illinois specifically has implemented a number of changes preceding the election in November. So can you talk about what some of those are? You talked about the extended voting hours.
Yes. Yeah. They're really, they kind of group in a couple of things. And I want to start with the first one because I really think that this is critical. Illinois for 2020, and I think there's some hope that we will do this beyond 2020, but for 2020, we have made Election Day a state holiday. That's really important for people. I think that's important beyond the pandemic in terms of, just encouraging people and making them understand that this is something they should be able to do. And frankly, that people should be able to do without having to worry about missing a shift or engaging in or worrying about themselves economically. The second thing is that they have expanded, as I said, the ability to get a mail-in ballot, including getting an application if you've voted in either the primary in 2020 or the 2018 and the 2016 elections. So if you're a regular voter, that's the definition of it, as it were. If you are a regular voter in that way, you're going to automatically get both the application and then the reminders about being able to vote. Secondly, it authorizes each election authority to create these return pickup sites or these return drop-off locations so that one doesn't have to be dependent upon the USPS. Among other, I mean, we've just seen recently where, for example, even in Sangamon County in Springfield, the election authority there, after some discussion with the community, found 3 locations in addition to the central location at the government building to have drop-off locations so it would be convenient to people from across the county and from across the community. Those kinds of things I think are very important. The bill also requires that each election authority, so every county and the city of Chicago, have a universal voting site where anybody in the jurisdiction can come and vote. That's part of early voting, but this will also be on election day. So if you live out in a neighborhood or a community in Chicago, but you're going to be downtown, there will be a place that you can go and vote on that day without having to worry about, can I get back to my home and get in the line and get there, and et cetera. The Illinois law also allows for election authorities to create curbside voting. So that for those, curbside voting has always been something that has been available for people with disabilities. And this just simply expands that opportunity for election authorities to provide that sort of assistance and help for anybody who might need it for whatever reason. We talked a little bit about early voting hours being expanded, so there'll be additional hours and days that you can do that. It allows an election authority to provide early voting hours that are specifically targeted for those with pre-existing health conditions, especially those that are COVID related or could be COVID affected conditions. So that's something that's critical. And one of the things that I think has gone a little bit underreported, but is a really great thing, is that for the first time, the new law for this year allows 16 and 17-year-old residents of the state of Illinois to serve as election judges. So even though, one of the things that we know from all of our voting experiences are that our election judges tend to be people who are older, perhaps retired, and who've been doing this and committing themselves to this for a very long time. One of the things here is that it allows younger people to do this who maybe aren't as worried about the COVID circumstance, but I think really, really importantly, also creates a new pool of people, frankly, who can become involved in this system and will become lifetime voters. And so, there are a variety of different things like that, I think, about this measure that are really critical and provide all of us a number of paths to vote and to make sure that vote is counted. And so it again goes to this place of, I think, for all of us is thinking about now how we're going to vote, making a plan for doing that. And then, as we always say, encouraging you to share that with others, because it might influence and help them in terms of thinking about the way in which they want to go about voting for themselves.
Right. And so let's talk about voting for people involved with the criminal justice system. So the ACLU of Illinois has been an advocate for making it easier for people who are being held in pretrial detention or returning citizens to have all the tools and information necessary to cast their vote. So can you talk to us more about the work you've done around that? And then also who within the criminal justice system is eligible?
Yes. So, and this is a really critically important area as we're, seeing across the country in terms of that. So number one, it is important to recall that anybody who is being detained pre-trial still remains eligible to vote under Illinois law. So one of the things that this measure does, the measure that we helped with a number of other groups pass and get signed into law last year, is it permits people in pretrial detention to the opportunity to vote, and it says that essentially jail authorities across the state of Illinois have to provide that opportunity. And it can be as simple, there's been great work done in here in Cook County to have, the Cook County Jail become a precinct and a place where people can vote. That's really critically important in a facility that large. Across the state, where those facilities may not be as large, it may be as simple as the sheriff's authorities having to assure that everybody gets an opportunity to fill out an application for a mail-in ballot, and then helping to make sure that those ballots get returned and get processed. Again, it can be a very simple thing, but making sure that people who are involved in the criminal justice system have that opportunity to vote is critical for a number of reasons. The second thing that the bill does is remember, under Illinois law, that once you have completed a sentence for whatever the issue, whatever you've been convicted of, but once you've completed that sentence, your voting rights are restored in Illinois. So the first thing that the measure does is it requires the Illinois Department of Corrections to provide some very basic information about that to people as they are leaving the care and custody of IDOC, and allows them to, allows people to understand that they can, re-register to vote and go ahead and continue voting. This is not a state where we deny people, that opportunity. And far too often, advocates and others have reported that when they, go door to door in some communities, that they often will run into people who'll say, oh, I can't sign this petition, or I can't vote because I'm not permitted to because I was convicted of X. Well, that's not true in Illinois. If you're no longer in custody, you can vote, and we want to encourage people to vote. And by the way, we want to do that for two important reasons. Number one, there's actually data out there that shows that once people return to their communities and their neighborhoods, the more connected they are with those communities, the more involved they are, the less likely they are to become recidivists. And so it's actually a public safety matter in some ways to ensure that people have that opportunity. Secondly, it's just fair. Let's be honest. I mean, it's just right. I will just say personally, I still struggle with the question of why it is that people who are incarcerated don't get an opportunity to vote. It's seemingly extending this in that way. The idea that we have, nearly 40,000 people in the state of Illinois that we've just said you can't be part of this process is really troubling. And honestly, when you look at it, when you look at the kind of communities, when you look at the kind of races like around state's attorneys' races or sheriff's races or other races that affect our criminal legal system, I think those voices of people who've been intimately involved in them are critically important. And frankly, it makes for poor policy to cut those folks out of having a voice in what those policies look like.
And so I think generally there's a little bit more uncertainty and anxiety around the upcoming election than there typically might be. So if there is voter disenfranchisement in Illinois, is the ACLU prepared to litigate?
We are, and we'll be working with our colleagues from here in Chicago and across the state if there's anything that we see. One of the things that I didn't say this, remember, you can register in Illinois right up to Election Day. You can walk into your polling place on Election Day and register and vote. It is critically important that people know that that happens. There's a lot of, including the ACLU, there's a lot of organizations who work on these issues and stand ready to do, the kinds of protection if it's necessary anywhere in the state and to help. But, candidly, I have to say that the good news is we've not faced the kind of issues here in Illinois that we've seen, across the state. One thing that a national colleague recently reminded me and a number of other folks was that, we've been fortunate in Illinois here that we've been expanding access to the ballot while other states have been shrinking it. And I think she, in a very smart way, reminded us all that, you know, that only happens because people are vigilant and because they're watching what's happening. And so, well, there's a temptation to go and say, how can I go help in Wisconsin, or how can I go help in North Carolina, or what can I do in Ohio? The truth is, in many ways, we're going to keep this here in Illinois by being uber local and really focusing on the work that we need to do here. Making sure, for example, that people returning from the criminal legal system get that opportunity to vote. Really assuring that these processes work well, because, you know, many of these expanded opportunities were passed by the legislature as only for 2020, but we want to make sure where these make sense and where they work, that they get expanded to going forward in, you know, for example, in terms of the election day being a holiday. That's something I'd like to see in 2022 and beyond. So I think there's all kinds of opportunities like this, and there's a reason for us to maintain a focus on what we're doing right here in Illinois.
And so, I mean, I think to close, where is the ACLU focusing its energy in these next few weeks before November 3rd?
So there's a couple of things. I'd say there's three things. I think number one is continuing to push out this kind of educational material, having people know what their options are and how to exercise those options. Number one, a lot of what we've talked about today. The second thing is really encouraging them, I think, as you've heard me say a few times, to make a plan, to ensure that we have, you know, that you have thought about what those are, informed yourself, and decided what works best for you, because it's not going to be the same for everybody. And then finally, and I think this is the last thing, you know, we have seen in the past, and we've actually seen already this year, you know, attempts to kind of intervene in this process by others. A few years ago, you may remember that when Illinois had its first big election using election day registration, that there suddenly was an effort on the part of some parties to come in and file litigation to try to block the implementation of that, you know, making, frankly, I think, specious arguments. All of these changes to the Illinois law for this year have already been challenged. A lower court, a federal court, has knocked them out and sent them packing, but that's not to say that they won't try to appeal and again get some injunction in place that just creates chaos. So, you know, those are places where we're watching and looking where, as we did a couple of years ago, be able to intervene and play a role in, because it's critically important that now that we have these rules and that they've been measured by their capacity to expand voting, we don't let those be chipped away.